Hey, Power Readers, we're finally in the New Testament. 14 days remaining on the 60-day reading plan, and we start with the Gospels. Now, Autumn and I want to share an idea with you today called the Gospel Connection. The Gospel Connection. You see, the Gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they were very intentional in connecting their books to the Old Testament. They had the prophets, they had the law of Moses, and we learned last week about the gospel, about the prophets and how they're looking ahead to the first coming. So let me put that up here. The first coming is the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And so the prophets were very intentional in looking ahead and giving us hints of the first coming. We also have the second coming, when Jesus comes back to establish his kingdom. But the Gospels are focused mostly on the first coming, and so the Gospel writers make links back to the prophets to basically say, hey, here's where this comes from. The Gospel, our Gospel, speaking from the writer's perspective, our Gospels are rooted in the prophets. That's why you'll see links to Isaiah and Jeremiah and Micah and Hosea, Malachi, and there's also some cool links going back even further with a genealogy. We know from our reading that Jesus, he comes from Adam. He comes from Noah, comes from Abraham, and comes from King David. He follows that line through the kings. And so Matthew, he gives us a partial genealogy going back to King David, and then to Abraham. How about that squeaky? And then we have Luke gives a very complete genealogy going all the way back to Adam. So he goes back to King David, he goes back to Abraham, goes back to Noah, and goes back to Adam. And so as you're reading all those names, you're thinking about the connection, because that's why they did that. That's why the gospel writers gave us those connections. Are we dropping markers?
Yeah.
So you need to know that the Andersons are not artists. Are we artists?
No.
No, we're not artists, but we are illustrators. She's my illustrator. Another thing is that Jesus made some connections to the future, to the second coming that hasn't even happened yet. This is 2020. 2020. We're overlapping here. And Matthew and Mark and Luke connect a sermon that Jesus gave to the second coming, because the disciples were coming to Jesus and saying, hey, when are you going to do these things? When is the second coming? They didn't call it the second coming, but they said, when are you coming back? When will these things happen? And so Jesus gives us, he gives us a prophecy of those things. Let's write down these books and chapters in Matthew 24 and 25, in Mark chapter 13, and Luke chapter 21. Pay attention to those chapters, because that's a particular sermon where Jesus is connecting the events to the future. In fact, he even mentions Daniel as one of the prophets. So you see all these connections are cool, and how they help us trust the gospel writings by connecting them to the entire Bible. Very cool. Enjoy your reading. You're doing awesome. We're getting closer to the end. Talk to you next week.